Yippee-I-O, my beloved, said Leroy. We are homeward bound. Maybelline looked to the left, and then she looked to the right. She let out a long whinny. Oh, said Leroy, I get it. He slid off Maybelline's back. He took off hold of the reins. Come on, horse of my heart, he said. I will show you the way home. Leroy walked ahead and Maybelline followed behind, and every once in a while she would give Leroy a friendly little bump with her nose, pushing him forward, and in this way the cowboy and his horse made their way home through the deepening purple dusk. Home was the Garden Glen Apartments on Unit 12. Unit 12 was a very small apartment, which was just fine because Leroy was a very small man. Maybelline, however, was not a small horse. She was a tall horse, and she was a wide horse, and she would not fit through the door of Unit 12. Goal! Dang it! Said Leroy Ninker. He gave Maybelline a little push, and when that didn't work, he gave her a large shove, but Leroy soon saw that it was impossible. All the shoving in the world was not going to make Maybelline fit through the door of Unit 12. Dag, blibber it, said Leroy. He actually felt like he might cry, which was ridiculous because cowboys definitely did not cry. Leroy closed his eyes, and Patty Lemark's face floated into view. She opened her mouth and said, Cogitate on item 1 if you care to move forward. Hank, you got to compliment the heck out of her. Leroy opened his eyes. He cleared his throat. He said, Maybelline, you are the best, squeeziest into a small spot horse that I have ever known. Maybelline twitched her ears to the left and to the right, and while the horse was busy savoring the compliment, Leroy gave her a hopeful shove, but Maybelline still wouldn't fit through the door. Flibber, gibber it, said Leroy. He closed his eyes and conjured up Patty Lemark's face again. He tried to remember the other items about Maybelline. He thought very hard. I got it, he said. Item 2 is that you are the kind of horse who eats a lot of grub. Leroy opened his eyes. Maybelline was looking at him in an extremely hopeful manner. Well, yippee, okay, said Leroy Dinker. I will make us some food, and then we will deal with the too small door. Maybelline looked as overjoyed as it was possible for a horse to look, and Leroy was moved to compliment her again. You are the most splendiferous horse in all of creation, he said. Maybelline whinnied long and loud. She nodded in agreement. She truly was an excellent horse. Leroy didn't think he would never, ever be done admiring her. Chapter 5. Leroy Ninker went into the kitchen of Unit 12. He opened the refrigerator and looked inside. Leroy had viewed many many westerns at the Bijou Drive-In Theater. He had seen a great deal of purple mountains and wide open plains. He had watched cowboys battling injustices and crossing rivers and eating beans. But he could not recall one movie where a cowboy said aloud exactly what it was that he was feeding to his horse. "Hey," said Leroy. He lifted up his bat and scratched his head. "Oats. But he didn't have hay, and he didn't have oats." "Dag, flibbered," said Leroy Ninker. Outside of Unit 12, Maybelline let out a long, loud whinny that had a question mark on the end of it. "Okay," Leroy shouted to the horse. "I am making you some grub." Yippee-i-o. Leroy grabbed a big pot and filled it with water. He turned the heat on high. He filled another pot with tomato sauce. Patty Lemark had said nothing about whether or not Maybelline liked spaghetti, but didn't everyone like spaghetti? After Leroy Ninker added the noodles to the pot, he went outside and leaned up against his horse. Her flank was very warm. She was an extremely comforting horse to lean against. Maybelline turned her head and looked at Leroy, and then she put her nose up in the air and sniffed. "That's right," said Leroy. "I am cooking you some grub." Maybelline whinnied. "It is spaghetti," said Leroy. "I hope you like spaghetti." It turned out that Maybelline did like spaghetti. She liked a lot of spaghetti. The horse ate the first pot of noodles in a single gigantic gulp. As far as Leroy could tell, she didn't even bother to chew. When she was done, Maybelline lifted her head from the pot and looked at Leroy in a meaningful way. Leroy said yippee-i-o, and he went running back into Unit 12 with the empty pot and started boiling more water. He opened another jar of tomato sauce. He made a second pot of spaghetti. After that, he made a third pot of spaghetti. By the time Maybelline was done eating, the stars were shining in the sky, and the moon was looking down, and there was not one needle of spaghetti left in Unit 12. Leroy Ninker was very tired. He leaned against his horse and looked up at the stars, but when he closed his eyes, what he saw was Patty Lemark. Her face was as big as the moon, and her mouth was opening and closing and opening and closing. Leroy knew exactly what she was saying. Patty Lemark was reciting item 3. "Maybelline," said Leroy. Maybelline turned and put her nose in Leroy's face. "I have remembered item 3, said Leroy Ninker. "Item 3 is that you are the kind of horse who gets lonesome quick." Maybelline nickered. "But you cannot fit inside Unit 12, said Leroy. Maybelline shook her head. Okay then, said Leroy, I will stay here with you. He took off his boots, he removed his lasso, he loosened his belt, and then he lay down at Mabeline's feet. He put his hat over his eyes. He sighed a happy sigh. I have made a lot of mistakes in my life, said Leroy Ninker from underneath his hat. I have done some things that I wish I had not done. I have taken some wrong turns. There was a long silence. Leroy moved his hat and looked up at Mabeline. The horse looked down at him. She was listening. There was a time in my life when I was a thief, said Leroy. I am now reformed. I hope you don't judge me, Mabeline, because I am a changed man. Mabeline let out a small chuff of hair. Oh, Mabeline, said Leroy, you are my horse. For me, you shine brighter than every star and every planet. You shine brighter than all the universes, moons, and suns. There are not enough yippee-i-os to describe you. Mabeline, I love you. Leroy Ninker had never imagined that he could string so many words together at once. It was the longest speech of his life. He looked up at Mabeline, and she looked down at him. Leroy's cheeks felt hot. He lowered his hat so that it covered his face. Good night, Mabeline, he whispered. Leroy closed his eyes. He thought very hard. Had his heart been waiting for Mabeline to come along so that it could open wide and he could speak all the beautiful words that had been hiding inside of him? It was an amazing concept to consider, and the cowboy fell asleep considering it. Chapter 6. Leroy Ninker dreamed that he was riding Mabeline on the open plain. In the distance, there were purple mountains, and high up in the sky, there was a daytime moon. The moon was looking down at Leroy and Mabeline, and it was smiling at them. In Leroy's dream, Mabeline was running very fast. In Leroy's also, she had a full set of teeth. It's just like a movie, thought Leroy. We are just like a horse and cowboy in a movie. The wind rushed across his face. It smelled like cinnamon and clover and spaghetti sauce. The wind is promising me wonderful things, thought Leroy, and then he thought, Patty Lemark is right. I am very good at speaking poeticals. Mabeline's hooves pounded on the earth. Mabeline's hooves were extremely loud. Leroy had never heard such loud hooves, even in the movies. Mabeline's hooves were as loud as thunder. The cinnamon and clover and spaghetti sauce scented. Wind blew harder and faster. It tickled Leroy's nostrils, and then it slapped him on the cheeks. The wind obviously was trying to tell Leroy something important. And then in his dream, Leroy heard Patty Lemark's voice. Wake up, Hank. She shouted, protect your horse. Leroy Ninker woke up. Thunder crashed. A bolt of lightning lit up the world. Dad, blibber it, said Leroy. It's fixing to rain. He stood. He hitched up his pants and pushed his hat down on his head. He looked at Maybelline. Her eyes were closed. She was still asleep. Horse of my heart, whispered Leroy, sweetest and most delicate of all springtime blossoms, I cannot let you be rained on. I will go inside and get you an umbrella. Maybelline's eyes stayed closed. I'll be right back, said Leroy. He turned and ran into Unit 12. While Leroy was gone, the rain began. A drop fell on Maybelline's nose. Another drop fell on her ear. The horse woke up. She lifted her head and looked around her. Terrible things were happening. Thunder was crashing. Lightning was flashing. And worst of all, Maybelline was utterly, absolutely alone. She was not the kind of horse who liked to be alone. Maybelline let out a long, questioning whinny. The thunder crashed, the lightning flashed. Maybelline called out again. Where was the little man? Where was the little man with the big hat and the beautiful words? Where was the little man who brought her spaghetti? Maybelline called out again and again. There was no answer. She didn't know what to do. And even Maybelline didn't know what to do. What Maybelline did was run. Leroy Ninker came out of Unit 12 holding an umbrella up high over his head. Here I am, my springtime blossom, he said, and I have brought you an umbrella. But when you got to where Maybelline should be, there was no Maybelline there. Maybelline, said Leroy into the darkness and the wind and the rain. Maybelline, the wind blew harder. Horse of my heart, said Leroy Ninker. The rain came down hard and fast. The lightning flashed, revealing a horseless world. Leroy stared into the emptiness. He heard Patty Lemark's voice in the wind. She was saying, do not leave Maybelline alone for too long, or you will live to rue and regret the day. A great gust of wind came along and grabbed hold of Leroy's umbrella and ripped it right out of his hands. Leroy watched as the umbrella spun up into the darkness. He was a cowboy without a horse, a cowboy without an umbrella. He was a cowboy absolutely, utterly alone. Chapter 7. The cowboy walked through the dark and stormy world shouting, Maybelline, Maybelline, Maybelline. In his haste to find his horse, Leroy had left Unit 12 without his boots and without his lasso. He was not all prepared to go on a horse search, and he had no idea where to begin. Patty Lemark's face appeared before him and said, don't forget the compliments. Hank and the grub. Maybelline, Leroy shouted, you are the queen of Yippee-I-O-ness. You are the most beautiful horse in all of creation. No horse appeared. Maybelline, Leroy shouted, there will be unending pots of spaghetti if only you come home to me. No horse appeared. Leroy thought about Maybelline and her bony spine and her 4 teeth. He considered her whiskered, velvety nose. He cogitated upon her twisting ears and how she bent her head down to listen to him. Oh, she listened to him so well. Maybelline, Leroy whispered into the darkness, you are the horse for me. The rain came down harder and the wind blew meaner. Leroy's socks were soaked through. This is the worst night of my life, thought Leroy. If there is anything worse than being a cowboy without a horse, It is being a cowboy who had a horse and then lost her. The wind howled and whistled, and then the wind grabbed hold of Leroy's hat and tossed it away. Dag blither it. You, wind, you. Leroy shook his fist at the wind. What am I going to do without my hat? Leroy Ninker was now hatless, bootless, lasso-less, and horseless. He had never felt less like a cowboy. I want my horse, Leroy Ninker shouted into the wind and rain. He sank to his knees. Give me back my horse. Please, please. Maybelline, I promise that if I find you, I will never leave you alone again. These words seemed so sad to Leroy that he started to cry. The wind blew stronger, the rain beat down, the world was very, very dark, and the cowboy was lost. Oh, he was lost. And where was the horse? She was lost, too. She was as lost as she had never been in her life. She was soaked to the hooves, and she was very afraid. She was also tired. She stopped running and held herself still in the darkness. She whinnied, and then she neighed, and then she nickered. Finally, she sighed. The horse wanted many things. She wanted the rain to stop falling and the wind to stop howling. She wanted the little man to appear out of the darkness holding a gigantic pot of spaghetti. But more than anything, Maybelline wanted to hear the little man's voice. The horse needed to hear some beautiful words. But there was no little man, and there were no beautiful words. There was just darkness and rain and wind. And since Maybelline couldn't think what to do, she started to run again. She ran without thinking or hoping. In the darkness, the horse went one way, and the cowboy, alas, went the other. Chapter 8. Leroy stood in a patch of mud. He looked down at his socks. They were very dirty. He looked up at the sky. He watched as the rain slowed to a trickle. The thunder grumbled and rumbled and then slunk away. The last raindrop fell. The world became very quiet. The sky was gray, but at the horizon there was the slightest hint of pink. Dawn is coming, said Leroy Ninker, and I do not have a hat or boots or a lasso or a horse. I don't even have an umbrella. I have nothing at all. Leroy watched the sun slowly rise. The orange ball of it glowed brighter and brighter. He shook his head sadly. He looked down at his muddy socks again. And then in the pink and hopeful light of dawn, Leroy noticed something in the dirt. He bent down and traced the shape that was imprinted in the mud. His heart thumped inside of him.